The county's fire model was wrong by 11 degrees. That was all it took. 11 degrees in wind direction, and the wildfire that was supposed to burn east across empty grazing land turned south toward Clayburn's industrial road, where the new power corridor stood half-cleared and waiting. The emergency team had satellite maps, drone footage, thermal imaging, and a command trailer full of radios. The utility company had engineers in clean boots, laptops glowing on folding tables, and the kind of confidence that came from trusting screens more than soil. Mabel Roy had a cracked leather notebook, a row of dying cottonwoods, and a memory nobody wanted. She was 78 years old, small enough that the fire captain had to lean down to hear her over the radios. Smoke dragged itself across the afternoon sky. Ash settled on the shoulders of men who had laughed at her 3 days earlier. When Mabel pointed toward the old windbreak behind her farm and told them the flames would split if they reached those trees, one young engineer actually laughed. "Ma'am," he said, "trees burn." Mabel looked past him toward the smoke line. "Not if they were planted for the wind," she said. No one understood what she meant. Not then. They would understand only after the flames reached the old tree line, struck the hidden limestone trench beneath it, and broke apart like water around a stone. But by then, the question would no longer be whether Mabel Roy was right. It would be why Clayburn County had forgotten the reason those trees were planted. If stories about forgotten land, old promises, and the kind of wisdom modern people are too quick to dismiss mean something to you, consider subscribing. Because what happened in Clayburn County was not just about a row of old trees. It was about the truth a whole town had learned to walk past. 3 days before the wildfire changed direction, Mabel Roy sat in the front row of the Clayburn County Annex with a folded notice in her lap. The room was full enough for shame to have witnesses. Utility workers lined the wall. Neighbors filled the folding chairs. 2 county clerks whispered near the coffee table, as if the old woman in front could no longer hear. At the back, Sheriff Dale Rusk held his hat in both hands and looked like he wished the floor would give him somewhere else to stand. At the front, Brad Kessler pointed a laser at an aerial map of Mabel's farm. He was young, clean, and confident in the way men get when every answer they trust comes from a screen. Behind him, a red line cut across her land and passed straight through the old cottonwood windbreak. 27 trees, crooked, weather-beaten, half-hollow in places. To Brad, they were an obstruction. To the county, they were a liability. To Mabel, they were the last markers of something Clayburn had spent decades trying not to remember. "This vegetation corridor," Brad said, circling the trees with the red dot, "creates clearance issues for the new transmission route." A few people nodded, grateful for words clean enough to make destruction sound responsible. Mabel looked at the phrase on the screen. Vegetation corridor. Her father would have hated that. Elaine Mercer, Clayburn's emergency planning director, stood beside the projector with a folder pressed to her chest. Her gray hair was pinned neatly. Her voice was soft, but every word carried the weight of a county seal. "Mrs. Roy," Elaine said, "we understand your attachment to the property, but those trees are aged, unstable, and potentially dangerous in dry conditions. Public safety has to come before private sentiment." Private sentiment. Mabel kept her hands folded. Behind her, Tom shifted in his chair. She did not have to turn around to feel her son's embarrassment. That morning, he had stood in her kitchen beside the bucket catching rainwater from the leaking roof and begged her to sign. The utility money would pay the taxes, fix the house, and maybe buy her a few quiet years without notices taped to the door. "Mama," he had said, tired and ashamed of sounding tired, "they're just trees." Now he sat 3 rows back, silent, his contractor's cap crushed between his hands. Then Vince Calder, the utility company's land acquisition attorney, stepped forward in a dark suit and placed a document on the table, as if he were laying down a sentence. "Mrs. Roy has been offered a fair easement settlement," Vince said. "If she signs within 72 hours, removal can proceed peacefully. If not, we will seek immediate access under county authorization." A murmur moved through the room. 72 hours. Mabel looked down at the notice in her lap. She had folded it that morning beside Henry's old coffee cup, the one she still kept near the window 9 years after his death. Brad clicked to another slide. The cottonwoods appeared again, now marked with hazard symbols. "There is no technical reason," he said, "to preserve obsolete vegetation." Someone in the back gave a short laugh. Not loud, just enough to make the room smaller. Mabel heard it. Slowly, She stood. The room quieted in that cruel, uncomfortable way people do when an old woman takes too long to rise. Her knees ached. Her back ached. The brass clasp of her purse had pressed a mark into her palm. But her voice did not break. "You cut those trees," she said, "and you won't know where the fire is supposed to turn." For one breath, no one moved. Then someone coughed into another laugh. Brad smiled politely, and somehow that was worse. "Mrs. Roy," he said, "fire doesn't follow old family stories." Mabel looked at the map behind him. "No," she said, "it follows wind." Tom lowered his head. Elaine closed her folder. Vince slid a notice toward Sheriff Dale Rusk. Dale walked it down the aisle slowly, his boots too loud against the annex floor. He had known Mabel since he was a boy. He had bought peaches from her roadside stand before the orchard failed, before Henry died, before Clayburn learned to call old things inefficient. Still, he held out the paper. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Roy," he said quietly. "If you don't comply, crews can enter Friday morning." The whole room watched her take it. Her son watched. The county watched. The utility company watched. Mabel folded the notice once. Then again. Then she looked at Brad Kessler. "You measure land from above," she said. "My father measured it with smoke in his lungs." No one laughed that time, but no one believed her either. By sunset, she was back on her farm. Orange flags snapped along the fence. The cottonwoods groaned in the western wind, their pale leaves turning over like hands. Mabel placed the notice beneath a glass jar on the kitchen table. Then she opened the drawer, took out her cracked leather notebook, and walked toward the trees alone. At the edge of the windbreak, she stopped. The sky had gone the color of old copper, and before anyone in Clayburn reported a fire, Mabel Roy smelled smoke. Long before Clayburn County called the cottonwoods a hazard, Mabel Roy had learned to read smoke the way other children learned to read weather. She was 16 the first time fire taught her that land could remember. It happened in the late summer of 1952, after 3 dry weeks turned the pastures brittle and left the creek stones exposed like old bones. Back then, Mabel was still Mabel Pike, a skinny girl with 2 braids and a habit of following her father wherever he went. Samuel Pike was not a man people quoted at county meetings. He was not a planner, not an engineer, not someone whose name appeared on brass plaques. He fixed fence, planted shelter belts, dug drainage by hand, and knew every low place where frost settled before dawn. His shirts smelled of cedar, sweat, and smoke. That August, the fire started west of Clayburn after lightning struck a hay shed near Miller Road. By noon, smoke had flattened the sky. By evening, people were running cattle through open gates, loading photographs into trucks, and praying the wind would not turn. But the wind did turn. Mabel remembered standing on the porch while her mother packed medicine jars and folded quilts into a flour sack. She remembered men shouting beyond the pasture. She remembered her father pulling a wet bandana over his mouth and telling her to stay by the pump. She did not stay. She followed him far enough to see what the grown men were doing beyond the west line, where the land dipped behind the Roy farm and the old worker cabins stood in a row nobody important ever visited. Seasonal families lived there then. People who picked, repaired, hauled, and disappeared from town photographs when the harvest ended. Samuel and 3 other men were digging into the hard ground with shovels. Not a wide trench, not deep enough to impress anyone, just a crooked cut through dry grass, packed with pale limestone chunks and damp clay pulled from a low pocket near the trees. "Fire runs where wind invites it," Samuel told one of the men, "so we give the wind somewhere else to go." Mabel did not understand. She only saw smoke, sparks, and her father's hands bleeding through the dirt. The cottonwoods were young then, no taller than a man's shoulder, planted in an uneven line that followed the trench instead of the property fence. Mabel had once asked why they were crooked. Samuel had told her straight rows were for people who wanted land to look obedient. Crooked rows were for people who had listened to it. That night, the fire came close enough to turn the windows orange. Mabel never forgot the sound, not the roar people described later in newspapers. What she remembered was smaller and worse. Leaves hissing, cattle bawling from a field away, her mother whispering every name she could think of. Then, near dawn, the wind shifted against the young trees and the fire bent. It did not stop. It broke apart just long enough for men to drag 2 families through the smoke from the cabins beyond the west line. By morning, Samuel Pike came home with ash in his hair and burns along his wrists. Clayburn thanked the fire department. The county thanked the warehouse crew. No one thanked the men who had dug in the dark. No one mentioned the cabins in the first report Mabel saw years later. 3 days after the fire, Samuel took her to the Windbreak. His cough had already deepened. Every breath sounded as if something inside him had been scraped raw. He pressed a cracked leather notebook into her hands. "If they ever come for these trees," he said, "you make them remember where the fire turned." Mabel thought he meant the farm. For most of her life, she would keep thinking that. Samuel died before winter, his lungs never clean again. At the funeral, people said he had been a good worker, a quiet man, dependable. They said it kindly, but kindness can still make a life smaller than it was. Mabel stood beside her mother and held the notebook against her coat, angry without knowing what to do with the anger. Years later, she married Henry Roy and moved on to the farm where the cottonwoods had grown tall enough to lean over the back fence. Henry was gentle, patient, and practical in the way farmers become when debt teaches them not to waste words. He never laughed at Samuel's notebook. He helped Mabel clear weeds from the trench, hauled water to the trees during drought, and replaced 2 saplings after an ice storm split them down the middle. But whenever Mabel asked what he remembered about the worker cabins, Henry's face changed. "Not much. Only enough. There was a lot of confusion back then," he would say. Then, he would find a gate to mend or a tractor belt to tighten, leaving the rest of the sentence buried somewhere Mabel could not reach. At first, she thought he was protecting her from an old grief. Later, after their son Tom was born, after the orchard failed, after hospital bills ate through their savings, she thought maybe Henry simply wanted peace. A man could carry only so much history and still plant in spring. So Mabel kept the trees because her father had asked. Then she kept them because Henry was gone. Then she kept them because the world around them changed so quickly that the crooked line of cottonwoods became the only thing that still seemed to know where it belonged. Tom never understood that. To him, the windbreak was shade, fallen limbs, insurance complaints, and another reason the farm looked neglected. He had grown up hearing pieces of the story, but not the whole of it. Because Mabel herself did not have the whole of it. She had a notebook, a memory of smoke, a father's last instruction, and a husband's silence. That was the wound she carried into old age. Not only grief, not only widowhood, the wound was knowing something mattered and not knowing how to prove it before the world cut it down. On the night after the county meeting, Mabel sat at her kitchen table with Samuel's notebook open beneath the yellow light. Between sketches of wind arrows and soil marks, one line appeared again and again in her father's blunt pencil. "West line is not the fence line." Mabel ran her finger under the words. Outside, the cottonwoods groaned in the dark. For the first time in years, she wondered if she had misunderstood the promise. And by morning, she would have to walk back to those trees and look at them not as memory, not as grief, but as the object everyone else had mistaken for dead wood. By sunrise, the old cottonwoods looked worse than they had the night before. That was the cruel thing about daylight. It did not soften age. It showed every split in the bark, every dead limb, every hollow place where woodpeckers had worked through the years. From the kitchen window, Mabel could see why Brad Kessler had circled them in red. The trees leaned unevenly along the back edge of the farm. Some bowed east, some twisted north. None of them straight enough to satisfy a man who measured land from a drone. A person could look at them and see danger. A person could look at them and see neglect. A person could look at them and think an old woman had confused memory with evidence. Mabel saw the way the lowest branches had grown thick on the windward side. She saw where grass stayed green 2 weeks longer near the roots. She saw the shallow dip that ran beneath the line, not quite a ditch anymore, but not natural ground either. In summer, dust gathered there differently. In winter, frost settled there first. After rain, the soil dried last. Those were the things her father had taught her to notice before anyone asked her to prove them. She carried Samuel's notebook under one arm and walked slowly toward the windbreak. The western sky was clear now, almost innocent, with only a faint brown smear low beyond the ridge. If she had not smelled smoke the night before, she might have convinced herself the county still had time to be reasonable. Near the first tree, she knelt and pressed her fingers into the ground. The soil was cool. Not wet, exactly. Held. That was the word Samuel used when land kept moisture below the surface longer than it had any right to. Behind her, a truck door slammed. "Mama?" Tom crossed the yard in work boots, carrying 2 paper cups of gas station coffee and the look of a man trying hard not to start a fight before breakfast. Mabel stayed on her knees. "You're early," she said. "I didn't sleep. Neither did I." He stopped beside the cottonwood marked with orange paint. The stripe looked ugly against the gray bark, like a wound drawn before the cut. Tom handed her one of the cups. She took it, though she knew he had brought it more as a peace offering than kindness. He looked along the trees and sighed. "They're worse up close," he said. "They always were. That's not a defense." "No." For a moment, they listened to the leaves rattle overhead. The sound was dry and papery, but underneath it Mabel heard the old rhythm, the way the wind broke against the staggered trunks and came through slower on the far side. Tom heard only branches that might fall on a fence. "The roofman called me back," he said. "He can do the patch before the next storm if we pay half up front." Mabel did not answer. "And the tax notice isn't going away." "I know." "No, Mama, I don't think you do." His voice tightened, then dropped again, as if he hated the sound of his own frustration. "That offer from the utility company is more money than this place has made in 6 years. You could fix the house, pay what you owe, maybe even stop living like every bill is waiting behind the door." Mabel stood carefully. Tom reached to help her, but she waved him off. "You think I don't know what it costs to stay?" she asked. "I think you don't know what it's costing you." That one landed. Not because it was cruel, because it was true enough to hurt. Mabel looked toward the farmhouse. One gutter sagged near the porch. The kitchen window had a crack in one corner. Henry's old barn jacket still hung by the back door, though no one had worn it in years. She was not blind to decay. She simply refused to let decay be the only thing that counted. Tom stepped closer to the marked tree. "These cottonwoods aren't a wall," he said. "They're not a fence. They're not a legal boundary. They're old trees in the way of a power line." Mabel opened Samuel's notebook and turned it toward him. On the yellowed page, her father had drawn a crooked line with arrows pressing against it from the west. Tom glanced down. "Mama, that's a sketch. It's a wind line. It's pencil." It was enough when he drew it. For him, maybe. Tom rubbed his face with both hands. But not for court. Not for the county. Not for people who need records. Mabel looked at the ground between the trees. "Then I'll find records. You tried. They said there aren't any. They said they didn't have any." Tom gave a tired laugh, without humor. "What's the difference?" Mabel walked past him to a place where the grass sank slightly between 2 trunks. She pushed aside weeds with her boot and bent down, brushing loose dirt away with her fingers. Pale stone showed beneath the surface, flat and chalky. Tom crouched beside her despite himself. "What is that?" "Limestone. I can see that. Not from this field." He looked at her. Mabel tapped the stone with one knuckle. "Your grandfather hauled it here. Him and others." Tom stared at the shallow line, as if seeing it for the first time, and refusing to admit it. A white utility pickup rolled through the open gate before he could answer. 2 men stepped out with measuring poles, orange ribbon, and a clipboard. One wore sunglasses. The other had a drill case. Tom stood immediately. Mabel stayed where she was. "Mrs. Roy?" The man with the clipboard called. "Survey crew. We're authorized to mark final removal points." "You're early," Tom said. The man looked at him, then at Mabel. "Preliminary only. No cutting today." As if marking a thing for death were different from killing it. They moved down the windbreak, tying fresh ribbons around trunks, tapping stakes into the ground, speaking in numbers. Tree 6, Tree 9, Tree 14, clearance angle, root hazard, access lane. At Tree 12, the younger man opened the drill case. Mabel's head lifted. "What are you doing?" "Core check," he said, "to document internal rot." The drill bit touched bark. Mabel stepped forward so quickly Tom caught her elbow. The tool whined. Wood dust came out first, dry and pale, then the sound changed. The bit struck something below the root flare with a hard metallic scrape. The young man stopped. Brad Kessler, who had just pulled up behind the crew, frowned from beside his truck. "What happened?" The worker pulled the bit back and looked at the tip. It was dusted white. Not with wood, with powdered stone. Mabel stared at it, and for one brief second the years fell away. She was 16 again, watching her father pack limestone into a trench by firelight. Brad walked over, annoyed. "Probably old Phil," he said. Mabel looked from the drill bit to the crooked line of trees. "No, not Phil. Placement." The cottonwoods had not grown above the trench by accident. They had been planted to hold it. And if the county records would not admit that, then Mabel would have to find the proof somewhere the county had not thought to erase. She closed Samuel's notebook and looked toward town. By noon, she would be standing inside the records office, asking for a map no one wanted her to find. The county records office smelled like old paper, floor polish, and air conditioning that had been running too long. Mabel Roy stood at the front counter with Samuel's notebook pressed against her chest, waiting while a young clerk typed with 2 fingers and frowned at a computer screen. Behind him, metal shelves held deed books, tax rolls, survey binders, and fire inspection folders. Everything looked ordered. Everything looked official. To anyone else, it might have felt like a place where the past had been safely kept. Mabel knew better. The past was only safe when someone powerful had no reason to lose it. "I'm looking for a fire map," she said. "Clayburn West Line, summer of 1952. There would have been cabins marked near the Roy place, maybe not under that name." The clerk did not look up. "Address? There may not be one." His fingers stopped. "No address?" They were worker cabins. He blinked at her, as if she had asked him to search for a ghost. "Ma'am, all property records are indexed by parcel, owner, or address." Mabel opened the notebook and slid it across the counter. On the page, Samuel's pencil line cut crookedly through old wind arrows and soil marks. "This was drawn after the fire," she said. "My father helped dig the break. There should be a map, or a recovery report, or a planning record." The clerk looked at the notebook without touching it. "That's not a county document. I know what it is. I mean, I can't use it as a search record." Mabel held her breath through the first wave of anger. She had learned long ago that anger made people dismiss old women faster. "Try Pike," she said. "Samuel Pike." He typed again. "Nothing." "Try Roy Farm, West Line." More typing. "Nothing." "Try Miller Road Fire." This time the clerk sighed before the search finished. "Ma'am, I'm finding a warehouse incident report from August 1952, 2 damaged barns, 1 livestock loss claim, and a fire department commendation. No worker cabins." Mabel stared at him. "No cabins?" "Not in the index. They were there. I'm not saying they weren't. I'm saying I don't have them." That was when Elaine Mercer stepped out from the side hallway with a folder in one hand. She did not look surprised to see Mabel. Somehow, that was worse. "Mrs. Roy," Elaine said softly, "I thought you might come here." The clerk sat a little straighter. Mabel turned, keeping one hand on the notebook. "Then maybe you can help me find what your office lost." A faint flush moved up Elaine's neck, but her voice stayed even. "These records have been through several consolidations. Some rural documents from that period are incomplete." "Incomplete is not the same as gone." "No," Elaine said. "But it is also not proof of anything." Mabel felt the room shrink around her. The clerk looked down. A woman at a copy machine slowed her work to listen. Elaine stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to make it seem kind. "I understand that yesterday was upsetting. The project is difficult. Change is difficult. But bringing old family sketches into a public office and asking staff to validate them is not going to stop a lawful easement." Mabel's fingers tightened around the notebook. "My father did not draw this for comfort. I'm sure he drew it because he cared about the land. He drew it because people nearly died." Elaine's expression hardened for less than a second. Then it was gone. "The official reports do not support that." There it was. Official. A word heavy enough to crush anything handwritten. Mabel opened the notebook again, more quickly this time, and pulled a faded photograph from between the pages. It showed the windbreak when the trees were young, a line of saplings bending beside raw ground. In the far background, barely visible, were 3 low buildings. She placed it on the counter. The clerk leaned forward despite himself. Elaine did not. "These," Mabel said, tapping the blurred shapes. "Those are the cabins." Elaine glanced at the photograph. "Or sheds. They had porches. It is too blurry to determine. They had children on those porches." The copy machine stopped. For the first time, Elaine looked directly at her. "Mrs. Roy, you need to be careful." "With what?" "With turning memory into accusation." The words landed clean and cold. Mabel saw, in the clerk's face, the moment he decided this was no longer a search request. It was an old woman causing trouble. She could feel the room shifting around her, not loudly, not cruelly, but with that small-town instinct to step away from anyone about to embarrass herself. Then the door opened behind her. Tom walked in. He must have followed her truck from the farm, or guessed where she would go. His face changed when he saw the notebook open, the clerk watching, Elaine standing there with county patience. "Mama," he said quietly. Mabel did not answer. Tom came to her side, but he did not stand beside her like an ally. He stood near her like someone trying to block a scene from getting worse. Elaine turned to him with sympathy ready in her eyes. "Tom, I'm glad you're here." That hurt Mabel more than the laughter at the annex. Because sympathy, when aimed past you, can become a kind of theft. Tom looked from Elaine to the photograph. "What is this?" "Proof," Mabel said. Elaine said, "An old picture that may or may not show structures no longer relevant to the easement." Tom exhaled. "Mama, this isn't helping. It is if someone looks." They did look. No, they glanced. The clerk pushed the notebook back across the counter, as though returning something fragile and inconvenient. "I can submit a request for archival review," he said, "but it may take several weeks." "We don't have several weeks. I'm sorry." Mabel gathered the photograph and notebook with hands that did not shake until she had turned away. Outside, the sun was hard and white. Tom followed her down the courthouse steps. "You're making them think you can't handle this," he said. Mabel stopped. "Handle what?" "The farm, the decision, all of it." She looked at her son and saw not cruelty, but fear wearing a hard face. "Is that what you think?" "I think if you keep doing this, they're going to say you're not fit to make choices for yourself." Mabel did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "And would you agree with them?" Tom looked away. That was answer enough. By the time they drove back, 2 utility trucks were parked near the Windbreak. "No saws yet. Only pruning crews," Brad Kessler said. "Preliminary clearance. Nothing that violated the order." But at the north end of the tree line, 3 young cottonwoods had already been cut down, their pale stumps bright against the grass. Mabel walked toward them without a word. The gap they left was not wide, only enough for wind to pass through without bending, only enough for dry leaves to lift and tumble toward the house. Brad stood with his clipboard, pretending not to notice her face. "Selective trimming," he said. "Standard procedure." Mabel knelt beside one stump and pressed her palm against the raw wood. Behind her, Tom was silent. For the first time, even he could feel the difference. The western wind came through the gap sharp and fast, carrying dust across the old trench in a thin, restless line. Mabel looked at the moving dust. Then, at the trees, still standing. The county records had given her nothing. But the land was beginning to speak. By the next morning, the gap in the windbreak had changed the sound of the farm. It was not dramatic enough for Brad Kessler to notice from a truck. It would not have shown on a satellite map or a county hazard report, but Mabel heard it before she opened her eyes. The wind had a sharper edge. For 40 years, the cottonwoods had broken the western gusts into pieces before they reached the house. They made wind move like water through fingers, slowed and divided. But where the 3 young trees had been cut, the air came through in one narrow blade, rattling the loose gutter over the porch and pushing dust against the kitchen door. Mabel stood at the sink with Samuel's notebook open beside her. The page showed the same crooked line, the same arrows. West line is not the fence line. Outside, the stumps were pale in the morning light. Tom arrived before 8, angry before he stepped out of his truck. He carried a roll of plastic sheeting for the roof patch and a sack of nails, as if practical work might hold the day together. "You called the records office again?" he asked. Mabel did not pretend not to understand. "I asked for the archival request number, and they said it had not been filed yet." Tom laughed once, bitterly. "Of course it hasn't. Mama, they're waiting you out." "No," Mabel said, closing the notebook. "They're counting on me not knowing what else to show." He looked tired. More tired than angry now. "What does that mean?" "It means paper isn't the only record." She took an old coffee can from beneath the sink and walked toward the windbreak. Tom followed because he did not trust her not to do something dangerous. That hurt, but Mabel did not blame him for it. Fear had made him practical. Debt had made him impatient. Love had made him sound harsher than he meant to. At the cut gap, she knelt near the shallow trench and pulled dead grass away from the soil. The limestone beneath was half buried, chalky, and pale. Tom stood over her. "If this is another drawing..." "It isn't." Mabel took a handful of dry grass from the coffee can and laid it in a thin line across the exposed dirt. Then she struck a match. Tom grabbed her wrist. "What are you doing? Watching? You're lighting grass after a county fire warning?" "A handful. Mama, stand back." The little flame caught slowly, no wider than her palm. It crawled along the grass, bent east, then snapped toward the gap where the 3 trees had been cut. The smoke pulled tight through the opening, faster than it moved anywhere else along the line. Mabel covered the flame with the coffee can before it grew. Tom stared at the smoke still dragging low across the trench. "That doesn't prove anything. It proves the gap changed the draw. It proves wind blows through holes." "No," Mabel said. "It proves this hole is where the line starts to fail." She moved 10 yards south, where the trees still stood thick. She repeated the test with less grass. This time, the smoke rose, twisted, and split around the trunks before thinning into the field. Tom said nothing. Mabel did not look at him. She knew better than to demand belief the moment a crack appeared in doubt. A county fire engine rolled slowly along the farm road before either of them spoke again. It stopped near the open gate. A young woman stepped out in a yellow brush jacket, dark hair tied under her helmet, one hand resting on the radio clipped to her shoulder. She looked at the coffee can, the blackened patch of grass, then at Mabel. "Mrs. Roy." Mabel rose carefully. "That depends who's asking." "Leah Moreno, Clayburn Fire. We got a call about smoke near your property." Tom gave Mabel a look that said exactly what he thought. Mabel ignored it. "I put it out," she said. Leah walked closer, not accusing yet, but alert. "You know we're under dry wind advisory." "I know. Then why test a burn line today?" Tom frowned. "Burn line?" Leah crouched near the trench. She pressed 2 fingers to the soil where the smoke had run low, then glanced along the cottonwoods. Mabel watched her face change. Not belief. Recognition. "My grandfather used to talk about old shelter belts doing strange things with grass fire," Leah said. "I thought he was exaggerating. They do, if they were planted right." Leah stood and looked at the gap. "Who cut those?" "Utility crew," Tom said. "Yesterday," Mabel added. Leah's eyes moved from the stumps to the standing trees. She stepped into the windbreak, then out again, testing the air with her body the way Samuel used to, as if wind could be read through the skin. "That gap is pulling," she said quietly. Tom looked at her. "So you see it too?" "I see something." Leah turned to Mabel. "Not enough to stop an order, but enough that I don't like it." For the first time since the annex meeting, Mabel felt someone standing near the edge of understanding. She took Samuel's notebook from under her arm and opened to the page with the arrows. Leah studied it longer than the county clerk had. "Who drew this?" "My father, Samuel Pike." Leah's eyes flicked up at the name. "Pike. You knew him?" "No, but my grandmother used to mention a Sam Pike when she talked about the Old West cabins." Tom straightened. "What cabins?" Leah looked between them. "You don't know?" Mabel's hand tightened on the notebook. "Not enough." Leah did not answer right away. Instead, she knelt again and brushed dirt away from the limestone. A flat stone shifted under her glove. Beneath it, something dark showed through the soil. "Metal." Tom crouched, despite himself. Leah dug with her fingers. "Careful now." Mabel lowered herself beside them, her heart beating harder than the small discovery should have allowed. They uncovered a rusted strip of iron, no longer than a man's hand. It had been driven beside the trench and hidden by roots. Most of the surface was pitted, but near one edge, letters remained. S. P. Below them, uneven but clear, were 4 numbers. E. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The wind moved through the cottonwoods overhead. Tom stared at the marker. Mabel touched the letters with one finger. Samuel Pike had left more than memory in the ground. Leah sat back on her heels. "Mrs. Roy," she said slowly, "if this line was built after the old fire, then cutting it now might be a bigger problem than anybody filed in that report." Tom looked toward the road, where heat shimmered above the dry grass. Far west of Clayburn, beyond the ridge, a brown column had begun to rise into the morning sky. Not close. Not yet, but no longer imaginary. Mabel closed her hand around the marker and looked at the gap in the trees. The land had finally given her a record. Now, she needed someone to believe it before the fire reached the place where belief would no longer matter. By noon, the smoke west of Clayburn had become too large for anyone to pretend it was pasture dust. It rose beyond Miller Ridge in a thick brown column, bending at the top where upper wind caught it and dragged it south. Radio chatter began before lunch. By 1 o'clock, the county alert system sent its first warning. By 2, trucks from 3 volunteer departments were moving along the highway, with lights flashing and sirens cutting through the dry afternoon. The official report would later say the fire began near a temporary utility line where brush had been cleared and left in piles too close to a service road. Brad Kessler would not use the word mistake. Not then. At the command trailer near Clayburn's Industrial Road, he stood beside a folding table covered with maps, laptops, battery packs, and paper cups of coffee gone cold. A large screen showed the fire perimeter in red. The projected path moved east across open grazing land, away from town, away from the new power corridor, away from Mabel Roy's farm. Brad pointed to the model. Current spread keeps it north of the Roy property, he said. The fire captain, a broad man named Ellis Wade, studied the screen without relaxing. Winds holding? For now, Brad said. Sustained west, northwest. Model has it. Elaine Mercer stood near the trailer door, phone in one hand, county radio in the other. Her face was calm, in the way official faces become when fear would be inconvenient. Then we hold resources at the industrial line, she said. We don't send crews to protect private trees. No one laughed, but the old judgment was still there. Private trees. A deputy's truck pulled up in a cloud of dust before Captain Wade could answer. Leah Moreno climbed out first, carrying Samuel Pike's rusted marker in a plastic evidence bag. Mabel stepped down more slowly behind her, one hand on the truck door until her knees steadied. Tom arrived in his own pickup seconds later, angry and frightened enough not to know which one came first. Mama, you shouldn't be here. Mabel looked past him toward the smoke. I was here before the fire was. Brad saw the marker in Leah's hand and frowned. This is not the time for historical artifacts. Leah's jaw tightened. It may be the time for local topography. Brad almost smiled. Fire behavior is already being modeled. Mabel walked to the edge of the map table. Ash had begun to fall lightly, tiny gray flecks settling on the screen, on Brad's sleeve, on the back of her hand. She pointed to the red projected path. That line is wrong. Brad exhaled. Mrs. Roy, it will not hold east. Captain Wade looked at her then, not kindly, not dismissively, but like a man listening for any useful sound inside a storm. Why? Mabel turned her hand toward the sky. Because the wind above the ridge is not the wind at the draw. It drops south when it hits the cut. It always has. Brad shook his head. We have real-time wind data. From the tower? Yes. Mabel looked toward Miller Ridge. That tower sits high. The fire won't. Leah stepped forward. I saw the draw at her windbreak, Captain. The gap they cut yesterday is pulling hard. If the fire drops into that low line, it could run toward the corridor. Elaine's eyes moved sharply to Leah. Firefighter Moreno, are you making an operational recommendation based on an old woman's sketch? Leah held up the evidence bag. I'm saying there's an engineered trench under that tree line, and your map doesn't show it. Brad turned back to the laptop, irritation now visible. The model includes terrain. Not that terrain, Mabel said. For 5 seconds, the command trailer was silent except for radios and the distant, restless sound of aircraft. Then the wind hit. It came first as a pressure change, a dry push against the side of the trailer. The flags along the service road snapped hard. Dust lifted from the gravel, swirled once, and ran south across the road instead of east. Captain Wade looked toward the smoke column. The top of it bent. Then the base followed. On Brad's screen, the red line was still moving east. On the land, the fire had turned. Update the feed, Brad said. A technician leaned over the laptop. It is updating. The radio cracked. Command, Division 2. We have southward spotting. Repeat, southward spotting past Miller Draw. Captain Wade stepped outside. Everyone followed. Across the dry grazing land beyond the industrial road, a line of flame moved through dead grass faster than something that size should have moved. It did not roar yet. It hissed and snapped, throwing sparks ahead of itself, hunting for the easiest path. And the easiest path was no longer east. It was south, toward the unfinished power corridor, toward the gap in Mabel's windbreak. Brad stared at the smoke as if the sky had betrayed him. How much shift? Captain Wade demanded. The technician inside called out, 11 degrees south of projection. 11 degrees. Mabel did not say anything. She did not have to. Captain Wade turned to Leah. You said there's a trench? Yes, sir. Can it hold? Mabel answered before Leah could. Not hold. Split. If you don't cut another tree. Brad snapped his head toward her. Trees burn. Mabel looked at him. Not if they were planted for the wind. For the first time, Brad had no quick reply. Captain Wade made the decision in less than 10 seconds. Move 2 brush units to Roy West line. Keep the dozer off those trees unless I call it. I want water on the cut gap and hand crews along the trench. Elaine stepped forward. Captain, that corridor is not approved as a fire break. Neither is losing the industrial road, he said. The next 30 minutes became a blur of engines, hoses, shouted orders, and ash. Mabel stood near Tom's truck because Tom would not let her get closer. But she could see the cottonwoods from there. She watched water darken the cut gap. She watched Leah and 2 other firefighters scrape leaves away from the old limestone line. She watched Brad, still wearing clean boots now dusted gray, kneel beside the trench and press his hand into soil he had only studied from above. Then the fire reached the west field. It came low at first, running through grass. The standing cottonwoods shuddered in the heat. Leaves curled. Bark smoked along the oldest trunks. The 3 cut stumps at the north end flared quickly, proving Brad right in the smallest possible way. Trees could burn. But the line did not behave the way he expected. The wind struck the staggered trunks and broke. Flame pushed into the trench, met stone, damp clay, and bare mineral soil beneath the roots. The front thinned. 1 tongue of fire bent north along the open grass. Another pulled south toward the service road. Between them, at the crooked line of cottonwoods, the force of it hesitated. Not stopped. Never stopped. Only divided. Only slowed. Only long enough. Hit the south edge, Captain Wade shouted over the radio. Now, now, now. Water swept across the service road. A brush truck advanced through smoke. Leah's crew beat down spot fires along the trench. For 15 terrible minutes, Clayburn seemed to balance on the width of an old ditch no one had put on a modern map. Then the worst of the front passed. The power corridor was scorched but standing. Mabel's farmhouse was dusted in ash but untouched. The cottonwoods smoked, blackened on one side, alive on the other. At the command trailer, nobody spoke for a while. Brad looked at Mabel as if seeing an impossible equation written in a language he had never learned. Tom stood beside his mother, breathing hard. You knew, he said. Mabel shook her head. I remembered. Leah came back from the tree line with soot on her face and something strange in her expression. She carried a folded emergency map from the trailer, its edges dirty from her gloves. Mrs. Roy, she said, spreading it on the hood of Tom's truck. Look at the split line. Mabel leaned over it. The burned path divided around the windbreak, then curved along a low strip beyond the west edge of the farm. Leah tapped the blank area on the county map. This is where the fire slowed before it turned. Tom frowned. There's nothing marked there. Leah looked toward the blackened field. My grandmother said there used to be cabins beyond that line. Mabel felt the old sentence return from Samuel's notebook. West line is not the fence line. The windbreak had proved she was right, but it had also pointed to something else. Something the fire had remembered better than Clayburn County. Leah lowered her voice. Mrs. Roy, what used to be on the other side of those trees? For one afternoon, Clayburn County did not know what to do with Mabel Roy. People who had laughed at her in the annex now avoided her eyes. Men who had called the windbreak obsolete stood beside their trucks and stared at the blackened cottonwoods as if the trees had become something they could not name. Brad Kessler walked the trench twice, saying very little, his clean boots finely gray with ash. But silence was not the same as surrender. By the next morning, the utility company had brought in attorneys. They arrived in a black SUV that left 2 neat tire tracks through the ash near Mabel's gate. Vince Calder stepped out first, still wearing a suit though the air smelled of smoke and wet bark. Behind him came Brad, carrying rolled maps under one arm, and Elaine Mercer, whose face had gone pale with exhaustion but not softened. Tom was already on the porch with Mabel, patching a strip of plastic over the worst part of the roof leak. He stopped hammering when he saw the SUV. Mabel did not move from her chair. She had slept less than 2 hours. The fire had spared the house, but ash lay on the porch rail, on Henry's empty chair, on the window glass, on everything that had almost been lost. Vince walked up the steps without waiting to be invited. Mrs. Roy, he said, yesterday's events changed the company's position. Tom lowered the hammer. Mabel looked at Vince's briefcase. I doubt they changed it enough. Vince ignored that. He opened the briefcase and removed a folder with a blue tab. The company is prepared to increase its easement settlement. Tom's eyes moved before his face could hide it. Vince noticed. Of course he did. The new offer includes roof repair allowance, property tax assistance, and a temporary residence provision if construction requires access near the home. Mabel said nothing. Vince placed the folder on the porch table. Generous, Tom said quietly. Almost against his will, Mabel looked at him. He looked away. Vince continued. In exchange, the company would request cooperation on vegetation management and a standard confidentiality clause regarding unverified historical claims related to the property. There it was. Not payment. Purchase. Mabel touched the edge of the folder but did not open it. Unverified historical claims, she said. Elaine stepped forward. No one is denying that the trees affected yesterday's fire behavior. Captain Wade's incident notes will reflect that. But that does not make the Windbreak an approved safety structure, and it certainly does not validate every memory attached to it. Mabel looked at her. The fire remembered better than your records. Elaine's mouth tightened. The fire does not create legal history. No, Mabel said. But sometimes it burns the cover off. Brad shifted beside the SUV. For the first time, he seemed less arrogant than cornered. I've reviewed the drone footage, he said. There's evidence of irregular subsurface stone along the tree line. That matters operationally. But it doesn't mean the route cannot be modified with mitigation. Modified how? Tom asked. Brad hesitated. Additional clearing. Grading. Removing unstable trees and replacing the trench with a modern fire control strip. Mabel almost laughed. They had seen the old thing work, and their first instinct was to destroy it properly. Leah Moreno arrived in a fire department pickup before Mabel could answer. She got out with a folder under her arm and soot still caught at the edge of her collar. She looked from Vince to Elaine and understood the room without stepping onto the porch. Mrs. Roy, Leah said, Captain Wade asked me to bring you a copy of the preliminary incident sketch. Elaine turned sharply. That sketch is not final. No, ma'am, Leah said. Preliminary, but she handed it to Mabel anyway. On the paper, the burn line split around the windbreak and curved along the blank west edge of the farm. Blank. Always blank. Tom stared at the sketch. So if the firebreak helped, he said, why still cut it? Vince answered before anyone else could. Because emergency usefulness in a single event does not override easement rights or infrastructure needs. Leah looked at him. It may override bad planning. Vince gave her a cold smile. That is not your determination to make. The porch went quiet. Tom picked up the blue-tabbed folder. He opened it. Mabel watched his eyes move down the page, watched the numbers reach him. The offer was large enough to be cruel. Large enough to repair the roof, pay the taxes, cover Tom's debts if he asked, and Mabel pretended not to know, maybe even keep the farm alive another few years. Tom swallowed. Mama, he said, we should at least talk about it. We are. I mean privately. Mabel heard the pleading under the words. Not greed. Fear. He had almost lost her house to fire yesterday. He had almost lost her to stubbornness, or courage, or whatever name a person gave to an old woman standing between trees and men with better equipment. Now he was looking at a number that could make practical pain disappear. Vince saw that too. We can give you until tomorrow morning, he said. After that, the company proceeds with formal filings. He left the folder on the table. When the SUV finally rolled away, Leah stayed. Elaine stayed too, just long enough to look toward the windbreak. Mrs. Roy, she said, quieter now, be careful what you dig up. Old fires do not burn only the people who started them. Mabel watched her leave. That was not a warning from someone who knew nothing. That evening, Tom drove into town to buy more roofing nails, though both of them knew the roof was no longer the problem. Leah returned to the station with the incident sketch. Mabel remained alone in the house with Vince Calder's offer lying unopened again beside Samuel's notebook. The number on the first page seemed to glow through the folder. She thought of the kitchen ceiling, the tax notice, Tom's tired face. Then she thought of Elaine's words. Be careful what you dig up. Mabel rose slowly and walked to the back room, where Henry's old things were kept in cedar boxes. She had not opened them in months, maybe longer. Grief had a way of turning ordinary rooms into places a person visited only when necessary. In the second box, beneath his winter gloves and a bundle of twine, she found a stack of envelopes tied with baling string. Most were receipts. One was not. It was addressed to the Clayburn County Planning Office. Never stamped. Never sent. Mabel sat on the edge of the bed before opening it. Henry's handwriting leaned hard to the right, just as it had on grocery lists and repair notes. I am writing because the west line on the Roy survey does not match what was there before the 1952 fire. Mabel stopped breathing for a moment. She read on. There are references to worker cabins past the old Windbreak. Samuel Pike knew about them. So did others. If the utility route ever comes through that line, somebody needs to ask why those cabins disappeared from the county map. The paper trembled in her hand, not because Henry had lied, because he had almost told the truth. Almost. Mabel looked toward the dark window, where the black shapes of the cottonwoods stood against the last red of evening. For years, she had believed Henry's silence was kindness. Now she understood it might have been fear. And if Henry had known enough to write this letter, then the truth was not buried only under stone and roots. It was buried in choices. Tomorrow, Mabel would have to find out whose. The truth did not come from the county records office. That was the first thing Mabel learned. The county had shelves, indexes, stamps, signatures, and official language. It had reports with clean margins and maps, where inconvenient places had been left blank. But the truth, the kind that survived being ignored, had gone elsewhere. It had gone into church basements, into family Bibles, into shoeboxes under beds, into the memories of people who had learned not to ask the county to remember them. The morning after Mabel found Henry's unsent letter, Leah Moreno came back to the farm in her own truck, not the department pickup. She wore jeans, work boots, and a tired expression that made her look older than 27. My grandmother's sister kept things, Leah said, standing in Mabel's kitchen. Pictures, funeral cards, baptism records. Stuff nobody thought mattered. Mabel placed Henry's letter on the table beside Samuel's notebook. Sometimes that is exactly why it survives. Tom stood near the sink with his arms crossed. Gazawaze wo. He had read Henry's letter twice and had said almost nothing afterward. Silence had settled on him differently now. Not disbelief, not agreement, something heavier. Leah drove them to a small white church 5 miles south of Clayburn, where the paint peeled around the windows and the cemetery leaned gently downhill. The church was not on any tourist brochure, it had no historical marker. But in the basement, inside a metal cabinet that smelled of dust and candle wax, Leah's grandmother had left 3 boxes labeled Moreno, Alvarez, Pike, and West Line. Mabel saw the last label and had to sit down. Inside were photographs. Not clear ones at first. Children in Sunday clothes. Men in work shirts. Women standing beside wash lines. A dirt road. A pump. A row of low cabins with narrow porches. The same shapes from Mabel's old photograph. Only closer. Only undeniable. Tom picked up one picture and turned it toward the light. In the background, beyond 3 children holding tin cups, stood the young cottonwoods, thin as broom handles. Leah's voice was careful. My grandmother said her family lived past the Roy West line for 2 seasons. She said after the fire, people were told not to go back. Why? Tom asked. Leah opened a brittle church ledger, because officially, there was nothing to go back to. The ledger listed names the county report had not. Moreno, Alvarez, Bell, Pike, Dawson, Rivas, 2 infants baptized in spring, 1 old woman buried in September, 3 families marked, relocated after fire. Besides several names, someone had written the same phrase in small, slanted handwriting. Cabins beyond West Break. Mabel touched the words. The room seemed to tilt backward through time. She saw her father again, coughing in the yard, wrists bandaged, saying, "Make them remember where the fire turned. Not where our farm was saved. Not where our trees stood. Where the fire turned." Leah unfolded another paper, this one copied from a newspaper archive in a town 2 counties over. The Clayburn paper had printed only a short item in 1952 about warehouse damage and volunteer heroism, but the regional paper had sent a young reporter before the county corrected the story. The headline was small, "Families Displaced After West Clayburn Fire." Below it was a photograph of smoke-blackened ground and a line of people standing near wagons. Samuel Pike appeared at the edge of the frame, face turned away, one hand wrapped in cloth. Tom leaned over the article. It says 12 cabins burned. Leah nodded. And Clayburn's official report says there were no residential structures in the West Field. Mabel closed her eyes. For 70 years, the county had not merely forgotten those cabins. It had removed them. Leah laid the final document on the table. It was not original. It was a copy of a copy, made from a private estate file that had belonged to the family of a deputy planner named Arthur Mercer, Elaine's grandfather. The memo was dated 3 weeks after the 1952 fire. Mabel read slowly, because some sentences needed to hurt at the speed they were written. Temporary labor dwellings beyond Roy West Line not included in final loss estimate due to unclear occupancy status and absence of formal leases. Tom whispered. Unclear occupancy? Leah's face hardened. They lived there. The memo continued. Recovery resources to prioritize warehouse district, registered farm structures, and transmission access. Avoid revision of west boundary unless challenged by landholder. Mabel looked at the last word. Landholder. Not family. Not worker. Not child. Landholder. Henry's unsent letter lay folded in her pocket like something warm enough to burn. Now the pieces had shape. After the fire, the county had needed the damage to look smaller. Fewer homes meant fewer failures. Fewer failures meant fewer claims. The worker cabins had been temporary, poor, inconvenient. Some families moved away. Some stayed quiet because they had no deed, no lease, no lawyer, no standing in a room full of officials. And the Roy farm had kept its west line, maybe not by theft in the way a man breaks a lock, but by silence, by correction never made, by maps nobody challenged because the people most harmed had the least power to challenge them. Mabel felt Tom watching her. My father knew? He asked. Mabel did not answer at first. She took out Henry's letter and laid it beside the Mercer memo. Henry's handwriting looked painfully familiar beside the county's typed cruelty. I am writing because the west line on the Roy survey does not match what was there before the 1952 fire. Tom read it again, but this time he did not look angry at Mabel. He looked wounded by someone already dead. He wrote it, Tom said. Yes, but he didn't send it. No. The basement was quiet except for the hum of old lights overhead. Mabel thought of Henry carrying water to the cottonwoods, clearing weeds from the trench, replacing saplings after storms. She had mistaken those acts for courage. Maybe they had been guilt. Maybe love and guilt had grown together in him until even he could not separate them. Leah turned a page in the church ledger. There were deaths, she said. Mabel looked up. Not in the official report. No, Leah swallowed. 3 listed here with burial dates after the fire. One was my grandmother's older brother. The words entered the room and changed everything. Until then, the cabins had been erased homes. Now they had names attached to graves. Mabel pressed both hands flat against the table. Her father had not only helped save people, he had watched some be left behind by a county that later thanked itself. Elaine Mercer's warning returned to her. Old fires do not burn only the people who started them. Now Mabel understood. The truth would burn Elaine's family name. It would burn Clayburn's official memory. It would burn Henry's silence. It would burn the clean story Mabel had told herself about the farm she had protected. And it might burn what little peace remained between her and Tom. Tom walked to the basement window, where dust floated in a thin bar of light. All these years, he said, we thought the county was trying to take our land. Mabel looked at the ledger. Maybe some of it was never only ours. He turned back. That sentence hurt him. She saw it. It hurt her too. But truth that cost nothing was only information. This was something else. Mabel gathered Samuel's notebook, Henry's letter, the copied Mercer memo, the church ledger photographs, and Leah's incident sketch. Together, they made a story no single document had been strong enough to carry alone. A living fire break. A missing line. A county report that erased people. A family that survived partly because another group had been written out. Leah looked at Mabel. What do you want to do? Mabel thought of Vince Calder's blue-tabbed offer on her porch table. The money that could fix the roof, the taxes, the tiredness in Tom's face, the quiet old age she could still buy if she signed. Then she thought of the word her father had used. Remember, not protect, not keep. Remember. She closed the ledger gently. We take it back to Clayburn, she said. Tom's face changed. To the county? To everyone. Leah nodded, but Tom did not. Do you understand what that means? He asked. If the West Line is challenged, if they say the old survey was wrong, I know. We could lose more than the utility money. I know. His voice broke at the edge. Then why? Mabel picked up the photograph of the cabins and held it between them. Because your grandfather did not breathe smoke into his lungs so we could keep a clean lie. Tom looked at the picture. 3 children, Tin cups, thin trees in the distance. For once, he had no practical answer. Above them, the church bell rope swayed slightly in air nobody felt. And outside, across Clayburn County, the blackened cottonwoods still stood, pointing toward a truth that had waited 70 years for someone to stop calling it sentiment. Mabel Roy did not return to Clayburn County with a speech. She returned with a cardboard box. Inside were Samuel Pike's notebook, Henry's unsent letter, Leah Moreno's copies from the church basement, the regional newspaper clipping, the fire incident sketch, and the Mercer memo that had turned a row of homes into an inconvenience. Tom carried the box. That was the first thing people noticed. Not because it made him a hero. It did not. His face was still tight with anger and grief. He had not forgiven Henry. He had not forgiven the county. Maybe he had not even forgiven Mabel for choosing the truth before choosing safety. But when Mabel climbed the courthouse steps, Tom stayed beside her. That mattered. The meeting was not official at first. Elaine Mercer had refused to call it a hearing. Vince Calder had called it premature and legally reckless. Captain Wade had called it necessary. By 4 o'clock, the county annex was full again. The same fluorescent lights, the same folding chairs, the same room where people had laughed when Mabel said fire followed wind. Only this time, nobody laughed when she entered. Brad Kessler stood near the side wall, arms crossed, eyes lowered. Sheriff Dale Rusk leaned beside the exit. Leah sat in the second row with her grandmother's ledger on her lap. Several older people from the South Church had come too. People whose families carried names the county map had not bothered to keep. Vince Calder rose before Mabel even reached the front. "Before anyone begins," he said, "I need to make it clear that unverified materials, private family papers, and church records do not establish legal boundary claims or infrastructure obligations." Tom set the box on the table hard enough to make Vince stop. "They establish people," Tom said. The room went still. Mabel looked at her son. Tom did not look back. If he had, he might have lost his nerve. Elaine sat at the front table with both hands folded over a blank legal pad. She had seen the memo that morning. Mabel had sent her a copy before bringing it here, not out of kindness, but because ambush was not the same as justice. Elaine had not replied. Now Mabel placed the Mercer memo in front of her. "Is this your grandfather's signature?" Mabel asked. Elaine stared at the paper. For a long moment, she said nothing. Vince stepped closer. "Director Mercer is not required to authenticate." "Yes," Elaine said. The word was small, but it moved through the room like a door opening. Vince turned toward her. Elaine did not look at him. "Yes," she repeated. "That is Arthur Mercer's signature." A woman in the third row covered her mouth. Leah opened the church ledger and began reading names. Not dramatically, not like a performance, just clearly. Moreno, Alvarez, Bell, Rivas, Dawson, Pike. Children, parents, workers, a widow buried in September. A boy listed as dead after the fire. Though Clayburn's official report had recorded no residential losses west of the Roy farm, Mabel watched Elaine while the names were read. At first, Elaine held herself perfectly still, as if posture could protect her. Then her eyes shifted to the photographs on the table. The cabins, the thin cottonwoods, 3 children holding tin cups. Her face changed there. Not enough for forgiveness. Enough for recognition. "My grandfather was deputy planner," Elaine said. "He did not start the fire." "No one said he did," Mabel answered. Elaine swallowed. "But he signed the report." "Yes. And the report excluded the cabins." Mabel nodded. Elaine looked toward Leah. "I grew up hearing that the West Fire was a warehouse incident. That was the phrase. Warehouse incident. My father said the old reports were messy, but he never said there were families." Leah's voice stayed even. "There were." Elaine closed her eyes. "I know that now." Vince shook his head. "Elaine, I strongly advise." She raised one hand, not looking at him. "No. I have advised people for 20 years to prepare for emergencies by studying what happened before. If our records erased what happened before, then every plan built on them is incomplete." Brad finally lifted his head. "The fire model was incomplete," he said. Everyone turned. He looked uncomfortable, but he kept going. "It was accurate for the data we entered. The problem is the data did not include the trench, the windbreak function, or the Old West structures. Mrs. Roy told us there was missing local knowledge. I dismissed it. The apology stopped there. Awkward, technical, insufficient, but real enough to begin with. Tom reached into the box and took out Henry's letter. His hand trembled once before he flattened the page. "My father knew part of this," he said. "He wrote to the county and never mailed it. I don't know why. Fear, maybe. Shame. Maybe he thought silence would protect us." His voice roughened. But silence protected the wrong thing. Mabel looked down. That was the sentence she had not been able to say herself. Sheriff Dale stepped away from the wall. "I witnessed the firebreak work," he said. "I'll sign that statement. And I'll sign that those trees should not be cut until the state fire marshal reviews the site." Vince's expression hardened. "The company will challenge any delay." Captain Wade, who had been standing near the back, spoke without raising his voice. "Then challenge it after I file my report." The room shifted, not into celebration, into responsibility. People began asking what could be done. Not all kindly, not all cleanly. Some worried about lawsuits. Some worried about property lines. Some worried Clayburn's name would be dragged through newspapers, but others asked for copies of the photos. A retired teacher offered to help identify families from church records. A farmer from Miller Road said he remembered his father mentioning cabins near the West Break. Leah's grandmother, small and bent in the second row, whispered that she still had one more box at home. Elaine took the legal pad in front of her and wrote 3 lines. Then she slid it toward Mabel. "Temporary suspension of tree removal. Emergency historical review. Full release of 1,952 fire files." "It is not enough," Elaine said. Mabel read the lines. "No," she said. "It isn't." Elaine nodded. "I know." That was the closest thing to an apology the room could hold that day. Not clean, not finished, but public. Tom stood beside Mabel as people began gathering around the table, looking at photographs that should have been seen 70 years earlier. Outside the annex windows, the evening wind moved ash along the street in thin gray threads. Mabel watched it pass. The truth had not saved everything. It had not repaired her roof. It had not returned the dead. It had not made Henry's silence painless or Elaine's signature harmless. But it had changed the direction of the room. And sometimes, Mabel thought, that was how a firebreak began. Not by stopping the fire, by giving people one narrow place to turn before the damage reached everything. By the next morning, Clayburn would begin arguing about land trust, language, state review, legal exposure, and old names that needed to be restored. And Mabel Roy would have to decide what part of the farm still belonged only to her. By the time the cottonwoods put out new leaves again, Clayburn County had learned to say the word windbreak differently. Not softer. More carefully. Spring came late that year. Black scars still marked the west field where the wildfire had run low through the grass, and the trunks of the old cottonwoods remained burned on one side. From a distance, they looked half dead. Up close, green buds pushed through the dark bark in small, stubborn clusters. Mabel Roy saw them first on a cold April morning. She stood beside the trench, with one hand wrapped around her coffee cup, and watched a thin leaf uncurl from a branch Brad Kessler had once marked for removal. She did not smile exactly, but something in her face eased. The utility corridor was moved 200 yards north after the state fire marshal finished his review. The official language called the decision a route adjustment based on newly documented fire behavior and historical land use evidence. Mabel thought that was a long way to say they had finally looked down. The company did not apologize. Vince Calder sent one final letter, written in a tone so polished it nearly shone. The increased settlement offer was withdrawn. The easement compensation was reduced to a smaller amount tied only to access already used during emergency work. Tom read the letter twice at the kitchen table. "That's it?" he said. "That's it. It won't fix the roof. No. It won't cover the taxes. No." He folded the letter and looked toward the ceiling, where the brown water stain still spread above the stove like an old bruise. For a moment, Mabel thought he might say what he had every right to say, that she had cost them the money. That truth did not patch shingles. That dead people did not pay bills. But Tom only stood, took his coat from the chair, and went outside. By noon, he was on the roof with 2 neighbors, a borrowed ladder, and a stack of shingles bought at contractor discount from a man who had sat in the annex the day Leah read the names. No speech came with it. No apology, just hammering. Mabel stood in the yard and listened. Sometimes repair sounded like that. Not words. Nails driven into a place that had been leaking too long. The land trust took longer. Nothing involving land, money, history, and shame moved quickly. Lawyers argued over language. The county worried about liability. The utility company objected to anything that might create precedent. Some residents complained that Clayburn was being punished for a fire almost no one alive had started. Leah's grandmother answered that one at the second public meeting. "No," she said from the front row. "You are being asked to stop benefiting from who was not written down." After that, the room stayed quiet for a while. The final agreement did not give Mabel everything she wanted, and maybe that was why she trusted it more. The Roy farmhouse and front acreage remained hers for as long as she lived. The West Windbreak, the limestone trench, and the strip beyond it where the worker cabins had once stood became the Clayburn West Firebreak Trust. Not a museum, not a memorial park with polished stone and speeches every September. A working trust. Its purpose was simple: maintain the living firebreak, preserve the recovered records, restore the names erased from the 1,952 report, and teach future crews how old land knowledge and modern fire planning could speak to each other before the next emergency. Elaine Mercer signed the county transfer on a rainy Thursday. She had not become beloved. People did not forgive history because one signature asked them to. Leah's family remained polite to her, not warm. Mabel did not invite her into the kitchen for coffee, but Elaine released the full archive, including documents that embarrassed her own family, and she stayed through every meeting where names were corrected aloud. That was not forgiveness, it was work. And work, Mabel had learned, was sometimes the only honest beginning. Brad Kessler came back in May with different boots. Not clean ones. He walked the trench with Captain Wade, Leah, and 6 young firefighters from 3 counties. He carried a tablet in one hand and Samuel Pike's copied wind sketch in the other. Mabel watched him try to match the old pencil arrows with the digital slope model. He struggled. Leah did not let him pretend otherwise. "Feel it before you mark it," she told the group. She stood at the cut gap, where the 3 young trees had been lost, and made the trainees close their eyes one by one. They laughed at first, awkward and embarrassed, until the wind shifted through the opening and touched their faces harder than it did 10 steps south. Then they stopped laughing. Mabel sat on a stump nearby with Samuel's cracked leather notebook in her lap. When Leah came over, Mabel held it out. Leah looked at it but did not take it. "Mrs. Roy, that belongs to your family." Mabel glanced toward the west strip, where volunteers had placed small wooden markers with names from the church ledger. "No," she said. "It belonged to my father while he was trying to make people remember. Then it belonged to me while I was trying to understand him." She pressed it into Leah's hands. "Now it belongs to whoever keeps the line open." Leah held the notebook carefully, as if it were both fragile and heavier than paper. Tom was repairing the old fence that morning. He paused when he saw the handoff. For a second, grief crossed his face. Grief for Henry, for Samuel, for the version of the farm he had thought was only theirs. Then he nodded once. Small, enough. By late summer, the west field had changed. Not beautifully. Honestly, the burned grass had returned in patches. The old cabin line was marked but not decorated. Children from the high school agriculture class came once a month to clear leaves from the trench and measure soil moisture under the cottonwoods. Fire crews added the windbreak to their maps, not as folklore, not as sentiment, but as infrastructure. The names from the church ledger were copied into the county record. Not all at once, not perfectly, but there: Moreno, Alvarez, Bell, Rivas, Dawson, Pike, and others still being found. On the first cool morning of September, Mabel walked the windbreak alone. Her steps were slower now. The ground was uneven, and Tom had begun leaving a walking stick by the back door without saying why. She stopped at the place where the fire had split. The scar was still visible if a person knew how to look. Dark soil, pale limestone, new grass, old roots. Mabel rested one hand against a cottonwood trunk. The living side of the tree was warm from the sun. The burned side was rough beneath her palm. For most of her life, she had thought keeping a promise meant holding on, holding the farm, holding the trees, holding the story until someone finally believed her. Now she understood that some promises were kept only when they were handed over. Behind her, Leah's voice carried through the morning as she taught 2 teenagers how to read smoke movement over low ground. Farther off, Tom's hammer sounded from the barn roof, steady and patient. The wind came from the west. It moved through the cottonwoods, struck the staggered trunks, and turned. Not sharply, not magically, just enough. The trees had been called a hazard once. Mabel never corrected them again. She only listened as the wind passed through, turning exactly where it was supposed to turn.